Hey everybody, welcome. I don't know if you can see, but the sun is quite golden as it's beginning to set, and in the tree in the old dead tree on one of the upper right hand branches there's a hawk. Uh, So before I begin, I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about a couple of topics. One being the idea of the new year. Because I wrote a post about this, last year, I guess. And I often, I have a Facebook account, and I don't really talk much about my personal life there for lots of reasons, but I use it a bit like a notebook, and I have for a long time now, probably at least 12 years. In any case, last year I posted something about the idea that I think our calendars are nonsensical. And so are machines like that one. In fact, I think those machines should just explode. I really wish they would, actually. Oh, I'm gonna get my phone shadow. Wow. Haven't really had that problem before in a video. It's kind of trippy. So I'll have to come at it from the side here to avoid the phone shadow. I don't know which side is my best side, but this side probably has less moles, so. Yeah, I think our calendar is nonsensical, and it's a weird representation of a repeating metric that, while it can serve some resemblance to the precession of moons and the sun in the 365-day cycle that we call a year, actual years should have varying lengths if the idea is even meaningful. And I think the idea is somewhat meaningful, right? We consider it, though the concepts are a little iffy, we consider it to be the measurement of one orbital cycle of the Earth around the sun, presuming, and I think this is a huge presumption, that the important thing the Earth is doing is orbiting the sun, and that's got the right precedence of value, right? Because what we tend to neglect in our common conceptual ideas is that precedence is produced by how you participate in something, not by the idealization of it. Thus, in a question earlier, a friend of mine asked something like, I wish I could remember the exact statement because it's important. How would one derive an orientation in a situation in which there were no directions, or in fact, the possibility of directions or orientation was precluded? And I said something like, an orientation is an idealized thing. You couldn't produce an orientation, but you might be able to orienteer, which is a behavior, right? And this places the precedence on the experiencer rather than on the abstraction. And this is one of the central problems in thought and language for human beings for thousands of years. And by problem, I don't mean, oh, here we have a conundrum. I mean something that will get us all killed and destroy the world, right? That's what I mean by a problem. This is a terrifying nightmare. It's not some trivial philosophical, diversion. So my friend said, yes, that distinction is valuable. I understand it. Because he gets that there's no such thing as ideals, and that abstractions are nothing like human experience. And my first response was something like, well, in a situation in which there's no direction, so this question comes from a philosophical problem about a sphere, a being who is a sphere, right? Like the Earth, for example. Except the Earth isn't a perfect sphere, but hey, close enough. Same with the sun. The sphere is distorted by various forces and situations, we might call them. Distorted, see? That's the weird idea. For the humans, anything that diverges from the perfect abstraction is problematical, so that's a distortion, right? Which, it should be the other way around. The derogatory idea should be the ideal, not the deviation from the ideal, which is natural and factual and ordinary, right? But for humans, representational cognitives like us, we think, oh no, the ideal is where the precedence is, and anything that diverges from the ideal is less than perfect, imperfect, and thus to be looked down upon, right? To be valued less, to not acquire the precedence. Hilarious. So I think my initial response was something like, and again, the problem comes, I have to keep backtracking because I'm so excited that I lose my train of thought. Imagine that we're talking to a being that is a sphere. And it's a sphere that lives in a space in which there are no distinctions available in the space itself. In other words, there are no heat gradients, there are no other central objects like stars, there are no magnetic gradients. And so if we were talking to a being like this, how might we attempt to communicate the ideas of forward and backward, right and left, up and down, even maybe before and after, if there's nothing to distinguish the space, right? So this is an interesting question. Okay, so now that I've posed that question, I have to come back to my previous thread. The precedence lies not with the ideal, but with the experiencer. Not with the abstraction, which is a model in which we've evicted participation, sensation, relation, right? For the sake of an ideal construct which appears to be generally or universally the case. And this brings up the problem of what we consider normal and abnormal, ordinary and non-ordinary, and all these similar matters, right? And these judgments, I have a number of friends who are constantly at pains to determine whether their behavior is normal or not, because they think, according to the common custom, that if their behavior is not normal, then something's wrong with them, right? Because there's only two sides, right and wrong, for the mind that makes abstractions and believes in them, right? You're either correct or incorrect. It's right or wrong. It's good or bad. It's these bipolar, mono-valued, monodimensional contrasts and conflicts, and there isn't anything else to this mind that thinks this way. Now, of course, when I think about things, I like to think about them in continua, right? So there's a spectrum from the most severe imaginable extreme of A to the most severe imaginable extreme of B, which appears to be its opposite, but is probably an aspect of a circle, one of the dimensions of which, right, the sort of, what we get in the continua is basically a semicircle, right? It's a half circle, but there's an underneath. And if we expand the dimensions, there's this dimension, right? There's the third dimension where the circle becomes a sphere. And you can add additional dimensions beyond that, and we should. So I tend to think in continua, but then I also add to that a layered array of topologies where there are complex conjugates of qualities instead of yes or no, black or white, good or bad, desirable or undesirable. And in fact, even the ideas of desirable and undesirable are deeply determined by what happens in the future, which is something we cannot ordinarily conceive of. We can think of it. So I guess we can conceive of it in a way. What I mean when I say we can't conceive of it is there are certain relatively ordinary predictions. If I drop this glass on cement from a height greater than 5 inches, right, it may break. If I drop it from a height of 17 feet, it will shatter, right? So there's certain kinds of predictions that we can make that are relatively obviously they are reliable, they are consistent, right? They are consistent with our experience. But what we don't know is if I shatter this glass, what future consequences will ensue other than the shattering? How will the shattering of this glass affect me? How will it affect future situations and circumstances? All of these things are unknown to us. And in order to determine that the shattering of the glass is the important event, we evict all of the other repercussions or consequences as trivial. We decide, well, those are trivial things because what I'm actually concerned about is what happens when I drop the glass. But the future of the universe is what happens when we drop the glass. So, and certainly that's inconceivable to us in the sense that it is impossible to predict or encompass the consequences with our representational consciousness, our evaluative consciousness, our rational or logical thought. All of these things, these are impossible things. Now, it doesn't mean, here's the big argument. Are we, in fact, actually or potentially in possession of faculties that might allow us to encompass the consequences much more completely or effectively in terms of predicting futures? And let's face it, predicting futures is very fucking important for every organism, right? If in the garden, if the blue jay or the sparrow decides to move from one branch to another, it has to check very carefully. And it doesn't just check, right? It's checking for predators, particularly raptors, because raptors are the most serious predator around here for small birds. It's also checking for humans because humans are dangerous. Humans can throw things or shoot things. Birds are aware of this. Excuse me. So the little birds have to check primarily for hawks and raptors, but they have to do something else. They have to intuit whether or not it is safe to move from a protected position to a less protected position right now. And when they are doing that, they are involved in predictive cognition, right? Also, they have to imagine things. They have to use memory. The memory of the fact of the common presence of predators, coupled with their proprioceptive condition in the moment, coupled with their history, their memory of historical situations, coupled with their capacity to imagine going from this branch to this protected branch to that less protected branch and the consequences of that and all of these kinds of things. It's not entirely dissimilar to what a human has to do to successfully cross a busy street. We have to make predictions. And so predicting things becomes fundamentally central to survival for, at least for complex organisms. But it's reasonable to imagine that analogs or superlogs exist for less complex organisms, such as bacteria, viruses, and other microorganisms, or even for organs in our body, which can be thought of, and I think it's useful to at least imagine this, as distinct animals or organisms encompassed by my skin, right? My distinct self, as if within us there's a zoo. Yeah. And this is a very useful idea. I've often remarked on the peculiar and unexpected situation that if I put my hand on my girlfriend's belly so that I can feel her belly, presuming I have a girlfriend, and I begin to talk to her stomach, it will begin responding almost immediately in a way that's loud enough that almost seems like her stomach is talking. And I've demonstrated this more than 60 times with various girlfriends throughout my life, and they find it amazing. I find the opposite thing amazing, that we don't think of our organs as beings. We think like, well, I'm the being, right? We're putting the precedence on the unity, not entirely unreasonable, but we should be able to inhabit the other position as well, where we put the precedence on the elements, right, that form the unity, and we attend them lovingly, caringly. So, again, the problem with the Earth orbiting the Sun is, where do you put the precedence, right? And the problem with a year is, what has the most important precedence? So clearly, for each of us, one of the frameworks that we use to understand time is how many years we've experienced, right? From our birth to the anniversary of our birth in the calendar. So many things I want to talk about. I wonder if I can reach them all. So that's an individual year. That's a way of individualizing the year, but it's not the only way. Some people could imagine the approximate date of their conception and go conception to conception as the anniversary. But again, they'd mostly be using the regularized calendar, which is a little weird. I'm not sure when the actual year should formally begin. It would be some compromise between probably the solstices and the moon cycles. The moon cycles are the little year, and the solstices would be the big year, but it's not entirely clear on which one of the solstices which one we should call the beginning, if we put the precedence there. In some cultures, particularly some Amerindian cultures, and probably other indigenous cultures, one of the things that demarcates age is not so much when one was born, but how many winters one survived, because winters, lots of people died or suffered terribly during the winters. So one's age might be expressed in winters survived, right? So the year would actually essentially become winter, whatever the beginning of winter, which is usually starts on a new moon, right? The first winter moon. How many winter cycles? Of 6 or 7 moons, I think. Is that right? Is it 6 or 7 winter moons or 6 or 7 summer moons? I can't recall. Again, it depends on where you put the precedence. But there are cycles in which, and the animals know the cycles, right? The humans don't determine the cycles by counting moons. They determine the cycles by watching the moon and observing the animals and plants. So the animals and plants determine, their behavior determines if, like, for example, the raptors don't set up nests in the moon cycle in which they ordinarily set up nests, this will be a 13 moon year, is one protocol or paradigm that is used, particularly in Blackfoot culture. Then you get an extra moon cycle in that year. And so, again, right, where's the precedence? The precedence in this case is to the raptor's mate in the 6th moon, right, or the specific moon in which they ordinarily mate. If they don't, we have 13 moons this year instead of 12. There are other, that's just one example of, there must be, 100 different models or frameworks or paradigms that are used by humans and have been used traditionally around the world. The Vedic calendar is probably lunar. The Jewish calendar is lunar. It's unclear to me whether the Islamic calendar is ordinarily lunar, but I suspect it is. Lots of indigenous peoples, maybe most of them, have lunar calendars, and the idea of January or Saturday is meaningless to them, completely ridiculous. So when does the year begin? It depends on where we put the precedence. And what's the meaning of a cycle? Because surely it's a relatively recent idea. Well, this may not be true. It's probable that there were other, even ancient peoples, who at least had the intuition that the moon was going around something. The moon, maybe the moon was going around the Earth, but the Earth was circling something, and probably the sun. Even though we, in our, written histories, presume that this was discovered at some relatively, recent time. It's unlikely to be true. It's conceivable, but it's unlikely. The fact is, we have no records of the ancient peoples. So today, in America, we celebrate the, we have what we call New Year's Eve, which is the last day of the previous year. And apparently, the first second after our clocks strike midnight is the beginning of a new year, a year that we number as 2022. I certainly never expected to live this long, and I also believed that we'd be living in a para-utopian future by now. At least in my youth I believed that. But that's because I believed the myth, the lethally deadly myth, that constant improvements in technology would free us from war, poverty, environmental decimation, and the other plagues that humans have instigated here on Earth. None of those things took place. What took place instead was more or less the establishing of a dystopia, or a layered array of dystopias, a feedback loop of, ever more complex dystopian processes, things like this. Now, I had a conversation with a friend of mine before I began this video today, and my initial intention was just to speak briefly about the problem of temporality in calendars. These days when I hear someone coughing, it's fairly disturbing, right? I've always been aware during flu season and cold season that people who are just, coughing, right, are spreading disease because we produce aerosols. Clouds and plumes. We produce aerosols and plumes. Clouds of microscopic and macroscopic particles that flow all over the place. Other people breathe them in, they get them in their eyes, they get them in their nose, and they become sick. And this is how primarily the flu has always been spread. You can get it by touching things and then touching your eyes, mouth, nose, touching one thing and then touching another thing and spreading it there, and then touching that thing later and then touching your eyes or nose or mouth or food. But most commonly it's spread by aerosols. So I've always been aware that if someone's coughing, like in the line in the store next to me, I get out of there. I don't want to get sick, and I don't like to be enclosed in a vehicle like one of the trains or buses or whatever, with other people because they're all it's essentially a carnival of contagions, right? Now, I'm not particularly germophobic, but I don't like to get the flu, and I don't like to get colds. It's a miserable experience, mostly. Though it does have some upsides as long as it doesn't kill you or fuck you up, injure you in some way. It has some upsides, right? It resets certain features of your body. It's a little bit like having a war inside your body because your immune system gets hyperactivated, and that changes all kinds of conditions in your metabolism and so on. The primary reason that we get achy and really tired when we get sick, at least this is the story I've heard, the description I've heard from my molecular biologist friend, is that our cells have to change. Many of our cells start producing immune proteins, or certain classes of cells is the right way to say it. And that's a lot of work and requires huge amounts of energy. So that's why we get tired and achy when we're sick. But these days, when I hear people coughing, I'm very concerned because I know that could mean death, right? Or permanent organ damage. And I think it's not entirely unreasonable that some people are concerned about the vaccine. There are reasons to have some concerns about the vaccine. It's not perfectly safe. And what we mean by safety isn't particular to individuals. It's a statistical idea of safety, right? It's generally safe for most people. But COVID is primarily unsafe for a vastly larger cohort and will kill some percentage of that cohort outright. The vaccine could contribute to someone's death, but is unlikely to kill them outright. Probabilistically, the massive danger is on the side of COVID, not the vaccine, at least for the moment. Though I agree that if we're going to administer a medication to hundreds of millions of people, we need to be 8 times more careful than we usually are, not less careful, as we apparently have been, whoever we is in this case. the medical establishment, researchers, medical infrastructure, and so on. And also, doctors don't think carefully enough about this medication. It's a political, an ideological decision. It's a religious decision. And the religion goes something like, science is real, medicine works, the vaccine is safe by declaration, because we're putting the precedence on the statistics rather than the individual, right? And there's no one for whom the vaccine is contraindicated, essentially, or nearly no one, right? Someone who's going to die anyway in the next couple days, they don't need to have a vaccine. But there's no differentiation, which there normally must be in any medical application or procedure, of the differences between different cohorts of people who are certain to respond differently to the vaccine, some of which it must be contraindicated for. Apparently there's no one it's really contraindicated for, or nearly no one. So that's ridiculous, and dangerous, and not scientific, and not proper medicine. Again, the precedence problem, right? We have the idealization. The idealization is the vaccine is safe and effective. Then we have the actual situation. Well, for each person, it may not be safe, and it's going to be varyingly effective. Though it is apparently true that for nearly everyone, those people who've been vaccinated and then caught COVID had vastly less severe responses to the disease than they might otherwise have had. However, since, again, there's a continuum from, right, nearly no effect on this side, right, to lethal effect on this side, and that continuum is going to be applied to everyone, whether or not they are vaccinated. There are certain people for whom the risks of vaccination outweigh the benefits, because we would not know if those people would catch COVID and be asymptomatic and have no significant lasting or even momentary effects. So it's a weird problem, right? And it's a problem of where we put the precedence. And it's a problem of idealization versus actual significant idealization versus local circumstances local to individuals and specific cohorts. We have noticed, for example, that there are some cohorts that really don't appear to be suffering dramatic infection rates. Africa is one of them. It's confusing, we don't know why. But clearly, and there are other cases where everybody got terribly sick, right? And this is the difference between idealizations and what's actually going on in the world, right? It's the difference between the idea of orientation and the behavior of orienteering, right? So, I had lots of different ideas about what to talk about today. But before I began my video, and I wanted to make one, so I'm giving up some meditation time this afternoon to make my video instead. I was talking with my friend Jessie, and she was telling me that she'd gotten a book that she'd been looking for a long time because she was very interested in it. And like me, Jessie has an interest in eccentric or exotic books, and some ancient books too. And apparently there's this old Greek manual of dream interpretation called the Oneirocritica, if I've got that right, which literally means dream analysis, right? Oneiro is a word particle that refers to dreaming. So the oniric cycle is the cycle in our day when our body expects to be dreaming. and an oneironaut is a dream traveler. And of course, critica probably means something like analysis or judgment. In any case, like many ancient books of its kind, the Oneirocritica is completely useless. It's simply a litany of, if you dream about this, it means that. You know? A dream of a toad means you will find a tasty peach later that day on a tree, or however it works out, right? Now, of course, it's impossible that these dictionaries of correspondences are useful. And this is why dream dictionaries are mostly garbage, because they have idealized the symbolism of dreaming, when to understand the language of symbolism and dreams, you have to include the context of the person, their history, what's recently been going on with them, your insight about their psyche and their character and so on, and all kinds of things. And one can learn to interpret the language of dreams with some degree of useful efficacy, or, again, a degree, right? Accuracy. But the waking mind is famously incapable of understanding the nature of the dreaming experience. In fact, it's almost directly opposed to it. It's diametrically opposed, largely. And particularly verbal and conceptual thought are not like what happens in dreaming. So when the waking mind gets a hold of a description of a dream, which has already been processed by the waking mind, or we'd not be getting a description, right? Because a dream is not a description in the same way a kiss is not a description. I challenge you to describe a kiss, right? You're going to capture nearly nothing of that experience. Or, describe the experience of eating delicious food or terrible food, right? You can encompass a little portion of the experience, but you can't communicate the flavors very well. Even the relatively sophisticated language of wine tasting is still nothing like tasting wine, right? The tail and the this and the that, the foretaste, aftertaste, whatever. Nothing like the actual experience of tasting the wine. You can't eat descriptions, right? You can't taste or kiss words. So it is, however, possible to develop the extremely nuanced and profound skill of interpreting someone's dream, though it requires all kinds of little sub-skills that have nothing to do with normalization. And these little dictionaries of correspondences that were produced and have been produced and are still produced for thousands of years, they tell us something not so much about dreaming, but about the left hemisphere, or the verbal conceptual mind, or the problem of representational cognition, where, literally, we become confused between the facticity of a statement and the facticity of direct experience. These two truth values get collapsed into one, right? So that now, because I have written, if you dream of a frog, you will find a valuable coin soon, right? Because I have written this, and it is certainly true that I have, formed or emitted these words, that becomes confused with the factual truth of the prediction. So the truth, and this is a problem we've seen like in government and science and medicine and all kinds of things, although less so in any science where testing and the reproduction of results is important. But yes, our last president apparently just believed that because he said something, it therefore must be true. And this is what's going on. What we see in these dictionaries of correspondences are the beginnings in the continuum of the development of representational cognition. There are landmarks, right? There are milestones, yeah? And the onset of the capacity to produce these compendiums of correspondences, portents, right? If the antelope turns left in the setting sun, hunting will be good tomorrow. If the mouse is timid, your enemies will flee, right? These correspondences demonstrate something about the strange continuum of the onset of, or the intensification of the power of representational cognition over other faculties that more or less resemble dreaming. And it's very clear that our ancient ancestors, our very ancient ancestors, were capable of predicting, and they were capable of having somewhat formalized thought. But primarily they were dreaming. They were dreaming while awake. And over time, our species ran face first into a brick wall of the possibilities of representational cognition as embodied in linguistic vocalization first and writing later. And that wall has been grinding us into hamburger for thousands of years, and the world along with it. And if we don't discover and realize the problems of these issues, we will kill everything. Everything on Earth will die. And people say, oh no, the humans aren't a big deal. They're wrong. They're dead wrong about that idea. They're like, well, the Earth will survive. They don't fucking know that. This is, again, the linguistic fucking mind making up bullshit statements and thinking because it can say things, they must be true, right? The Earth is very fucking delicate. It's delicate enough that literally, and I saw this coming 30 years ago, a single human being, one person, can formulate a threat significant enough to obliterate life on Earth and can table that threat against the entire world, or simply enact it. And I know this because with the technologies that exist today, like that was never possible, say, 500 years ago. Very unlikely to have been possible 300 years ago. Not so likely 100 years ago. As of about 50 years ago, it began to become possible. Within the past 20 years, it's fully possible. And the onset of specific technologies, which I'll not here name, makes it not only possible, but likely in the modern time. And by the way, there are aspects of representational cognition that not only, okay, how to put this? Part of the reason this is so dangerous, let me come back to that danger in a moment. I'll just put a bookmark in the danger. These little booklets of, if you dream this, it means that will happen, and so on. Or portents, or similar kinds of things. These are the symptoms of the growing dominance of representational cognition as enacted in language and writing. And there are hallmarks that you can see occurring if you look back in history. And one of the first people that I ever encountered who remarked on this was Julian Jaynes in his, dare I say, seminal work, which contains many mistakes but is nonetheless absolutely brilliantly imperative and urgent. The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. He was on to something really provocative and profound about the evolution of human consciousness. And there are not many books about this. I think another one is The Discovery of the Mind by Bruno Snell. There are one or two others that don't immediately come to mind, but yeah, I'll not chase the author names at the moment. So the emergence of Bibles, skybooks, books that tell you what everything is and what it is for and what will happen if you believe this book and what will happen if you don't believe this book, that's another one of the hallmarks that we're still suffering the catastrophic after effects of the emergence and the promulgation of such books. These books are diseases. I'm not saying there are no holy beings or that there's nothing metaphysical about human life. I'm saying that books that declare what you must believe about such matters in incredibly crude ways that will destroy whole civilizations are poisonous. They're deadly. In fact, one could argue that nothing other than science and technology in the past 100 years, which we should look very carefully at, has equaled the destructive power of these books. They have ruined lives and minds and hearts, civilizations, for thousands of years, and will continue to do so far into the future. And there are various other kinds of books that are just as deadly. So, in Snow Crash, there was the science fiction novel Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, I think. There was the idea of a terrible book called a Nam Shub that obliterated the whole, was deadly enough that anyone who saw it would be destroyed. I actually don't know the story of the Nam Shub very clearly. There was another book very recently that was really good. Don't know if I can recall the title of it though, or the author. In this book, a cult used psychography to figure out how to control individual people, how to perfectly control them with language. And one particularly unusual young woman, I know who this belongs to. One unusual young woman is capable of resisting this force, but develops not just a word so much, but an idea and certain capacities in language that cause humans to go insane and just kill everything around each other. And it spreads contagiously. I think the name of the book is Lexicon. Yeah. And it was an interesting science fiction novel. But very profoundly important in the age of psychography, social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on, where we're being literally psychographized electronically on purpose by corporations that intend to dominate and market to and otherwise manipulate us.
Did you just find that?
I did. Is it yours?
Yes,
I was looking for who it belongs to.
And then I lost the
thought it
other
might be my
one.
friend. Oh, I'm so sorry.
I have to go back and find the other
Well,
one.
if I see the other one,
I
I'll
think I
find
lost
you.
it down there. I better find it.
Okay, well, if I see it, I'll pick it up and find you.
Okay.
My name is Darren.
My name is Jen.
Nice to meet you, Jan. I'm glad that I was able to return your glove to you. Yeah, no, I'm still talking too. So nice to meet you, though. Okay. If I find it, I'll come get you. It's so wonderful to have a joyful moment with another human being, and so refreshing, and so different from this rather didactic, lecture that I've been giving. All right, the danger. I have to reorganize my thoughts now because it's complicated. Actually, what just happened is the kind of mind that I was embodying and enacting is radically different from the form of mind that immediately replaced it when I began to relate directly with another human being, especially with a sense of kindness and joy. That's nothing like the mind with which I lecture or with which I explore ideas. Okay, now I've just found her other glove, so this is going to be even more distracting. Now, hey man, good to see you. And to you. Yeah, we'll talk soon.
Yeah, I know you're on the phone.
No, I'm just making a video. I'm making a video, so I'll catch up with you. That's my friend Brian. He's really awesome. So again, I have the same problem, right? We think, oh, a mind is this kind of thing. No, it's not any kind of thing. A mind depends on what we're doing with it. It's like having a hand, or it's like having many kinds of hands, or even more like having many kinds of possible wings and many kinds of eyes within those wings that see in different ways as those wings learn to fly. And so most of what a mind can be, we will never experience in our modern existence. There's an old quote from Arthur C. Clarke that any form of sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And there's some useful truth in that quote, though I'm not a big fan of tropes and aphorisms. I write them sometimes. I just realize that they're dangerous. They're almost immediately ironic. So I re-quoted him and said, any form of sufficiently advanced ignorance is indistinguishable from modernity. Now that's a very cynical thing to say. What I'm trying to get at is we are born with the seeds of thousands of faculties that can, in fact, see into the past and the future in ways that have nothing to do with logical thought. We can learn to be telepathic. We can speak inside each other's minds. We can speak inside each other's souls. We can explore other bodies. We can inhabit the bodies of animals and plants and living places. All of these things and many thousands more are available to us, but our ideas and our idealizations and the models and concepts to which we are subjected that we imagine to liberate us from superstition are actually at the same time cripplingly prescriptive of terrible impoverishments that we will live with most of our lives. Hi, Jan. Here's your other glove. I'm so happy to be able to return it to you. And it's wonderful to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
have a wonderful new year.
too.
I hope
Yeah,
perhaps
happy New Year.
I'll see you again sometime.
Yes, I hope so too.
Okay, bye-bye for now. She's awesome. So that's funny. I wonder which hand I brought her first, the left or the right. It matters. Yeah, sidedness in humans is very important, but actually nearly all organisms are bilaterally symmetrical, and the two sides differ in their way of being in the world. And this is the important thing, or not but this is a very important thing to understand about the nature of being alive. So we have all these faculties, most of which we will never even taste. And this is part of why we have these stories like fantasy novels and science fiction in which there is magic and other intelligences, and why we have skybooks, which in a sense could be understood as early versions of science fiction. They are speculations and weirdly normative declarations about the nature of the most important things. What is the universe for? What is it doing? What does it mean to be alive? What is light? What is time? Why is there a world? Why are we born? What is death? What happens after death? What happens before life? All of these questions, right? But unfortunately, the left hemisphere, the least equipped aspect, and it's not just the left hemisphere, right? Obviously, the hemispheres always work together in people who, have both of them. But there are situations in which certain aspects of one hemisphere are more active than certain aspects of the other, or are relatively dominant, right? Certain aspects of my hemispheric laterality the difference between the faculties in my two hemispheres, light up when I'm lecturing, as I am now, and you can see the complete change that overcomes me when instead I'm relating with Jan about her glove, right? And that's a radical transformation of the moment of what we might call the moment of lateralization behavior or an action. And it's not just the brain. This is another one of the idealizations. All of your faculties are in your brain. Bullshit. The brain is nothing without a body. There's no such thing as a brain in a box. And the idea of a brain in the box is how we got computers, which are really fucking dangerous for human beings to have, because we don't have the intelligence that's capable of guiding our technological development in a way that produces insight and intelligence rather than disaster and environmental catastrophe, war and disease. So the onset of the dominance of what I like to call representational cognition, which I associate with particular modes of largely left hemispheric dominance, activity, inaction. The story over time of the development and of the relationship between humans and representational cognition, language and its bizarre effect on us. It's literally like we ran into something like lexicon. We ran face first into a weird sort of coding that would not only change the nature of the animal we could become, and part of this had to do with our discovery of the capacity to make tools with our hands, right? Using our hands changed how we would think and what we would become. And let's see. So literally it was almost like we ran into a meat grinder, and what it kept grinding out was conceptual formulas, models, prescriptions, and these weird little books like the dream books. The dream books are indicative of a hallmark in that process, an ancient hallmark, where the left hemispheric aspects, the developing dominance of verbal conceptual cognition and representational cognition, just as the processes that were developing in that time expressed as symptoms of where we are in that process, things like these little dictionaries of portent correspondences, what we call spells, hilarious irony there, dream dictionaries, and so on. And that led eventually to the bizarre and dangerous declaration, and this is a very important aspect of pseudo-left hemispheric dominance, right? It doesn't ask questions, it declares. And it doesn't care about verity. If it can say it, it is the truth. And if you don't believe that truth, it will destroy everything. This is the really weird aspect of the parts of our minds and societies that echo them. See, at least in our bodies, we have a right hemisphere that interrupts some of this shit and corrects it. You can see that happening when I encountered my friend Jan. You can see the sudden transformation of my consciousness, which is a beautiful thing to see, and a wonderful feeling. But our societies don't have any corrective right hemisphere. The left hemisphere just keeps saying over and over again, you will do the thing, you will do the function, or I will kill everything, right? And that's kind of how the left hemisphere is. It's disembodied. That's why we have these models of idealization of time, right? It doesn't care about nature or the moon or any of these things. In fact, it doesn't care about anything except its own models. And so there's this property of this kind of consciousness that emerges particularly in certain forms of schizophrenia, and when people are triggered to do violence. There's this property of I will kill everything. You know, one of my schizophrenic friends has taught me very deeply about this property, and when this aspect of his consciousness is triggered, which he's fully capable of resisting, thankfully, the goal becomes just to kill everything, right? Destroy everything. If the things don't do what I say they should do, all of them should die. This is a simple statement of this aspect's character. And strangely enough, there's a property in dreaming. There's an aspect of the interaction between the waking and the dreaming mind that I call the dream assassin, that is, its function is to destroy the dream world. And the way that it does that is by instigating a significant conflict or violence or terror. And when it does that, the adrenaline collapses the dream manifold and we wake up. Now, obviously, the character in the dream that catalyzes that process, right? The sort of the dream hitman, right? That character collapses when the dream manifold collapses. But what if that character crossed over into our waking mind? And now this character wants omnipotence. And since over here it is catastrophically impotent and no one acknowledges its authority, it wants to kill everything. Everyone. The whole world should be destroyed. The universe should be destroyed. The destruction of the universe should itself be destroyed, right? It's an infinitely recursive necessity of obliteration of a completely disembodied process that is uncorrectable once it becomes dominantly established in a people or a single mind. So this is part of the great danger, though there are many others. And let's see here. Geez, I've been talking for an hour. You know, my friend asked me earlier, do you think the transformation from oral traditions to written traditions was part of the problem? And sure, it is part of the problem, but it's also more like part of the symptom, right? Now, instead of song, we'll have speech. And now, instead of speech, which is still filled with music, we'll have writing, in which there's no music, unless you are sub-vocalizing. And then from that, we'll go to code, in which there's no language, there's no music, there's just numbers, right? And this is a fundamental problem for life on Earth. The humans have to resolve these matters. We have to learn to distinguish between the kind of truth, the facticity of spoken words. The words I am speaking now are the words I am speaking. That is true, right? That kind of truth, and the truth of meaning. Embodied in one of the paradoxes that was probably not first produced by Bertrand Russell. Oh, wow, what just happened there? Surely someone besides Russell formulated this before he did. But many of us are familiar with the paradox. This statement is false, right? Now, one of the problems with that statement, the first thing we should notice about it, I think, and there's a more complex thing that I'll introduce shortly, is that the statement has no content. And a statement that has no content cannot have truth value. It has to have null value, right? The value of the statement in terms of being true or false is null. The same way that I didn't see the hawk or owl take the prey, but I saw it strike the tree. It was kind of magical. I saw it strike the tree, and then it disappeared. I don't know how it did that. It's mysterious and magical. So the first thing we should notice is that the statement has no meaning, therefore it cannot be either true or false. It must be null. It's if we declare that our goal is determined whether it is true or false, we have to say, no, it is neither. It's a null statement, it's a meaningless statement. However, there's a more important thing to understand, which is kind of paradoxical if you examine it very deeply. No statement shall promote itself to the order of minds which are necessary to interpret statements. Right? And that's what this statement is doing. by self-reference. There's more complex statements of this principle. No statement shall, by self-reference or other means, promote itself to the function of minds which are necessary to interpret statements. But simply stated, no statement is a mind. And statements that propose or pretend to be minds should be very carefully dismissed. Now, the irony is that my formulation of the antidote, in a sense, because it is universal, it does what it's telling us statements shouldn't do, right? But that's a very complex feature, and it's okay if it does that as long as it eliminates the problem along with itself, like the dream assassin eliminates itself along with the dream. Although that's a really weird comparison that I wasn't expecting to make. So for now, as it is getting dark, and New Year's Eve, in the Western world anyway, is upon us, and we're about to enter a seemingly impossible future, I think I will wind up my video. We can solve these problems if we become intuitively, emotionally, and intellectually aware of them. In order to solve them, we have to realize their natures and origins and characters. And as we do this, the problems do get solved. When I finally understood what the dream assassin was doing in my dreaming life, suddenly it transformed and I was able to overcome it. Now, that isn't necessarily a good thing, because in my dreaming life, that being or that function embodied as a being in my dreams serves a very important purpose. So I don't want to make that purpose go away, but I do want to understand its nature, why it is attacking me in my dream, right? And resolve that conflict. So what is required isn't just that we intellectually understand some of the things that I've said. We have to come to realize them in terms of their relationship with our own natures as human beings, as individuals, as collectives and cohorts and pods. We have to understand their effect on our awareness, and how to free and retrieve some of the faculties that are otherwise completely inhibited, destroyed, or impaired by our relationships, our common and habitual relationships with language, concepts, and representational cognition. And we can learn so much from the ancient books, and learning about the the strange hallmarks and landmarks and milestones of the development of these problems when we see things like compendiums of, dictionaries of dream symbols. A toad means it will rain, blah, 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 right? Those books aren't particularly useful for what they pretend to be, but they are profoundly useful in helping us to understand the history of the development of the predicament we find ourselves in as moderns. Thank you for joining me. I hope you have I wish you all blessings and joyful success in all the aspects of your life and thought in the coming year and the coming years, and even in our history. Thank you for joining me. Bye-bye for now.